In the following tutorial, we will be going over how to set up your GitHub Enterprise Managed User account against Microsoft Entra ID as your single sign-on provider. Now, before we begin this setup, it's important to highlight that you must be in Azure your global administrator for your tenant. If you do not have at least global admin rights, you will not be able to complete this setup. Additionally, when you're logging into your enterprise, it's important to highlight that the login user is not your GitHub account. For this setup, you should have received an email that looks something like the following, where it lets you know that you have been added as an owner for your enterprise name. It will give you also your username that you must be using, and it's asking you to reset your password. Now, I do advise that rather than clicking on this button, you go ahead and right-click, copy the link, and open that link on an in-private browser or a different browser. Or before you do, make sure you log out of your current GitHub account before you begin this setup to avoid any issues along the setup. Now, I've already done this process where I have already resetted my password. So now I'm going to go ahead and log in with my admin user account. So for this setup, I'm going to be using two web browsers. I'm using Chrome and Edge. In Chrome, I'm going to be logging into GitHub for this setup. And in Microsoft Edge, I'm going to be setting up the Microsoft Entra ID part of it. So with that being said, I'm going to go ahead and input my password and click on sign in. So once I've signed in, I am directed to the overview page of my enterprise managed user tenant. Now, the first thing that I'm going to do for this setup is I'm going to go ahead and generate an access token so that I can configure SCIM later on during this setup. For this, I'm going to head over to the top right side and click under my user account. From here, I'm going to scroll down over to Settings. In Settings, over to the left side, I'm going to scroll down to where it says Developer Settings. And from Developer Settings, I'm going to click on Personal Access Tokens, Classic Token, and within the panel for Classic Tokens, I'm going to select from the dropdown, Generate a New Token Classic. Now, once done, the following will appear. You can really give it a name. The name of this token is going to be Microsoft Entra ID SCIM. Now, you can really name this token whatever you want. For me, it's just easier to identify what this token is about. Additionally, you're going to be set to set up an expiration date. For this video tutorial, I'm going to leave it with a default 30 days. However, I do suggest you try to map this with the same expiration as your public certificate that we'll be setting up later on. You can set it to no expiration or at least a year. It's really up to you. The importance of this token is that if this token expires, Microsoft Entra ID will be unable to provision or deprovision users, as the token will no longer be valid. So keep that in mind when setting up the expiration date. Now, with that being said, I'm going to scroll down. I'm going to look for Enterprise Admin or Admin Enterprise, which is this option right here. I'm going to select this. Once done, I'm going to scroll all the way down and click on Generate Token. Once I've generated my token, I'm going to go ahead and copy this token. Once copied, I do suggest you copy the token in another place, as we'll be needing it later on. In this case, I'm using Visual Studio Code as my notepad. So I'm going to go ahead and just create a new file for this. And I'm going to keep that token there for a minute. I want to go back into GitHub. Since I've already created this token and I don't really need to do anything else, I'm going to go ahead and click on Continue Setup. This will redirect me back into my tenants overview. From here, I'm going to click into Identity Provider. And from Identity Provider, I am provided with two options: OIDC for single sign-on and SAML single sign-on. Now, what's the difference here? OIDC gives you the capability that when a user logs in, you have better control over their interactions and token validation or expiration. So if I were to set up OIDC, every time I clicked on the tab within GitHub, this will revalidate and recheck if my user is still valid to have access to whatever the user is trying to access. Now, this is pretty beneficial in case, let's say, your users have personal computers and they're accessing your GitHub account for accessing company resources. Maybe you want to make sure that they're on the company's VPN before they're able to do so. You can set that up through conditional access policy on Microsoft Entra ID. And using OIDC can be used to validate that. But every time they try to change tabs or do anything, that validation is still going to be rechecked over and over again. Now, if you only set up SAML, for example, your users will still need to log in through SSO. But let's say you also set a conditional access policy where the user must be within your allowed IP range to authenticate through a VPN. So your user goes ahead and authenticates the first time. That will save a token within their web browser. And they can disconnect from their VPN and they can still access your system because that token is still valid until that token, of course, expires. Now, depending on your level of security, you do want to choose if you want to select OIDC or SAML. You can learn more about the details of each by clicking on Learn More about OpenID Connect OIDC or learn more about SAML single sign-on. Now, in both options, you're still in control of the user account, which means the user account will be provisioned through your IDP, in this case, Microsoft Entra ID. And the single source of truth for authentication will still be Microsoft Entra ID. The major difference comes to be what level of control do you want to have regarding the user session. You will still be able to deprovision users as well, directly from your Microsoft Entra ID tenant. Now for this setup, I'm just going to go ahead and set up SAML. So I'm going to go ahead and click on Add SAML Configuration. And from here, I'm being requested a couple of values. Now, I'm going to leave this here for now, and I'm going to jump into Microsoft Entra ID so I can start setting that up and obtain those values. So for Microsoft Entra ID, I am using Microsoft Edge as my web browser. I'm going to go ahead and click on Enterprise Applications. I'm going to add a new application. And from the Microsoft Entra gallery, I'm going to search for GitHub. Now, you'll notice that you have a significant number of apps that come up. I'm going to select GitHub Enterprise Managed Users. I'm going to go ahead and click on that application. And what I'm going to do here is, the name is really not that important, but for convenience and to make it easier for me to find my application, I'm going to go ahead and name this the name of my enterprise. So I'm going to go back into GitHub, and the name of my enterprise is actually this one right here, but for simplicity, I'm going to use the one from the URL, which I do recommend that for the entirety of the setup, when referencing the enterprise ID or enterprise name, you actually pick the one from the URL. This is just to make sure that you're hitting the right endpoint. It's usually followed by github.com/enterprises/GitHub Playground EMU. In this case, that's the name of my enterprise. Whatever appears here for you, that will be the name of your enterprise. I'm going to go ahead and copy this, and I'm going to go back into Microsoft Azure. And I'm going to paste the name right here. As I said, the name really doesn't matter. Then again, for me, it's just easier to identify this. And it saves me time and having to go back and forth between my setup when I need the enterprise name. So now I'm going to go ahead and click on Create. Now that my application has been created, I'm going to go ahead and click on Set up Single Sign-On. From here, I'm going to select SAML. And I'm taken to the SAML Setup panel. Now, before I even begin, and this is something I do advise, is that you head over to Users and Groups. And from Users and Groups, you add your user. This is the first step you want to do because at a certain point within our setup, you're going to have to authenticate from GitHub against Microsoft Entra ID. If your user has not been added, the problem you're going to be facing is that when you try to achieve the authentication, you might get a 403 unauthorized, simply because of the fact that the user you're trying to authenticate has not been granted access to the application. Therefore, to avoid that, you can just go ahead and add the user now. By clicking on Add User and Group, I'm going to select my user, search for my account, click Select. Now from here, it's pretty important that you define the role. Since we're setting this up for your first user, you are the enterprise owner. If you select any other option that's not the enterprise owner for your account as a GitHub Enterprise admin or owner, you will not be able to have any of the admin level capabilities. So I'm going to go ahead and select Enterprise Owner. Click Select, and finally Assign. So now my user has been assigned. At this point, I can go ahead and click on Single Sign-On. From here, I click again SAML, and we can begin the setup. Now to begin the setup, I'm going to go ahead and click on Edit. From Edit, I need to fill out the identifier, reply URL, and single sign-on. Now, the SAML application does give you some examples. However, my advice is do not use these examples. The examples you want to use, and I will be linking the documentation within this video under the description, is the one that can be found within the Microsoft documentation, which will give you the URLs that you need for this setup. The same applies when we're setting up SCIM. Now, I'm going to go back into Microsoft Azure because I've already taken note of the URLs that I'm going to be needing. And I'm going to start by adding the identifier. So I'm going to go ahead, add the identifier, paste the URL, and I will replace the enterprise name with my enterprise name. Now, this is the reason why I actually used the URL as my identifier for this application, because this pretty much prevents me from having to go back and forth between GitHub. But in case you name it something else, just as a refresher, if you go back into GitHub, you're able to pull the name of your enterprise directly from the URL. It is preferred that you pick this one just to make sure that you're hitting the right endpoint. With that being said, I'm going to go back into Microsoft Azure to continue setting up my SAML configuration. Now, do make sure you're not adding any additional forward slashes or spaces within your setup. Adding any of those could actually impact your configuration. Now, I'm going to add the reply URL. I'm going to replace this section right here with my enterprise name. And finally, the sign-on URL. Great. Now that I made sure that I don't have any spaces or deleted any forward slashes by mistake, at this point, I can go ahead and click on Save. Now, once saved, I'm going to go ahead and close this out, and you might get a pop-out to test your single sign-on application. Do not test your application right now because keep in mind we have yet not enabled this on GitHub. Therefore, the SAML endpoint for user authentication is yet not valid. So go ahead and click on No, I'll set this later. Now, from a setup perspective, we have completed the SAML configuration on the Microsoft Entra ID. From here, you're going to need a couple of values. You're going to need the login URL, the Microsoft Entra identifier, and your base64 certificate. So for starters, let's go ahead and get that base64 certificate by clicking on download. Once downloaded, I'm going to go ahead and open this within my Finder. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to open this with Visual Studio Code so that I can have it handy. Perfect. Now, I'm going to leave this here for now, and I'm going to go back into Microsoft Entra ID. And I'm going to start setting up my GitHub side of things, as I already have the values that I needed. I'm going to start by copying the login URL. I'm going to go back into GitHub and paste it where it says sign on URL. I'm going to go back into Microsoft Entra ID. And I'm going to copy the Microsoft Entra identifier. And then back into GitHub. And finally, I'm going to paste the public certificate. That public certificate is the one we have opened in either your Notepad or, in my case, Visual Studio Code. Make sure not to add any additional spacing. You want to make sure that you're not adding additional spaces or line breaks. You want to make sure that's clean as possible. And I'm going to go back into GitHub and paste that value right here. Now, it's a good practice. I always like to expand this just a little bit, just to make sure I did not add any additional spacing at the bottom or at the beginning. And now that I've validated that this looks good, I'm going to go ahead and click on Test SAML Configuration. Once done, this is going to send me over to authenticate against Microsoft Entra ID. And since my authentication has been validated, you'll see a positive message on top stating, your SAML provider settings have been validated. Remember to save your changes. Perfect. You'll also get a double verification at the bottom stating passed. Successfully authenticated your SAML SSO identity. Now, if we hadn't added our user as a first step in Microsoft Entra ID, this would have failed. Additionally, if your account does not have global admin permissions, this would have also failed. So it's important that we keep that in mind. Now that everything looks good on the GitHub side of things, I'm going to go ahead and click on Save SAML Settings. As soon as I do, GitHub will provide me with single sign-on recovery codes. These codes are extremely important. If something were to happen to your Microsoft Entra ID, let's say the certificate expires, or there's some miscommunication for maybe a configuration change, the only way you can regain access as a setup admin account is via your username and password, but you will be requested one of these recovery codes for security. So you can download those or copy them and store them in a secure location. And once you do, you will be able to enable SAML. For now, I will just go ahead and copy them, and immediately you see this option becomes enabled. And I'll go ahead and click on Enable SAML Authentication. Now that I've enabled SAML Authentication, I'll go ahead and proceed on setting up user provisioning. So I'm going to go back into Microsoft Entra ID so we can start that setup. Now from your Microsoft Entra ID application, we're going to go ahead and click on provisioning. Now from within provisioning, click on Get Started. On the provisioning mode, we're going to select from the drop-down and change this to automatic. And now it's asking for the tenant URL and it's asking for a secret token. So this tenant URL, you can obtain it directly from the Microsoft documentation. I will be posting the links in the video description, which is this URL right here. Now, I'm going to go ahead and copy that URL And I'm going to go back into GitHub and paste this URL right here. It does request that we change the last part to the actual name of our GitHub Enterprise. So in this case, I'm going to go back into GitHub. Copy my enterprise name directly from the URL. Go back into Microsoft Entra ID and paste that right there. Now, it's important that you make sure there's no spaces at the beginning or the end, just to make sure the URL works. And this secret token that's asking for was the token that we created at the start of this video. In my case, I copied that token on my Visual Studio Code. I'm going to copy that token from there, go back into Microsoft Entra ID, and paste my secret token right here. Once done, I'm going to go ahead and click on Test Connection. Now, I can see that the connection was successful. So now I can go ahead and click on Save. Great. Now that I've saved those settings, you can see a confirmation message as well right here, which says updating user provisioning settings. That's great. I'm going to close this out. And I'm going to click on the top URL to go back to my provisioning overview. From here, I'm going to go ahead and click on Start Provisioning. Now, what our enterprise application for GitHub Enterprise Managed User is going to do, it's going to look within the app under users and groups and look at every single user or group that you have there. And it's going to start provisioning them into your GitHub tenant. Now keep that in mind that provisioning is done in a fixed 40-minute cron job. However, you can use provision on demand to provision users immediately rather than waiting for the cron. This is highly beneficial if you're using a group, or if you have an individual user that you want to provision a little bit faster. This will be one way of doing it. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy this entire app name right here, and I'm going to go back into my enterprise applications. I'm going to search for it, access it again, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to add another user so you can see how that provisioning works. Or even better, I'm going to go ahead and add a group of users. So I have a test group right here. I'm going to select my test group. And I'm going to define the role that the users within this group are going to have. In this case, let's say these are all my enterprise owners in case I have many, or they can also be users. It's up to you. It's really just for me to show you how this is done. I'm going to select enterprise owners, select, and assign. Now, when assigning users, it's pretty important that you keep in mind that we do not support nested groups. So if you had a group within a group, that will not be provisioned. Your group must be made of individual users. Now, with that being said, I'm going to go back into provisioning to see how that is going. From the provisioning tab, I can already see that one user has been provisioned, which is great. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back into GitHub to see those changes reflected. So now that I'm back into GitHub, I can go ahead and click on People. And within People, I can see my user that has been provisioned. And you can see that the user provisioned is using my user principal name and the slug for my URL or my enterprise tenant. Now, I'm still logged in as the enterprise setup admin, better yet said. What I'm going to do is, before I log out, I want to show you why is this user so important. If we go back into Identity Provider, this is the only user that can turn off SAML. Even though I'm going to log in next with my enterprise account as an enterprise owner through the user that has been provisioned, I won't have this option. That is done for security reasons, that only the setup admin can turn off SAML. Now I'm going to go ahead and click on my user and sign out. I'm going to log back into GitHub now. When I'm logging in, I'm going to input my username. And what I want you to notice is that right now it says sign in. But the moment that I do underscore, you immediately see how that changes to sign in with your identity provider. That's how GitHub recognizes that this is an enterprise managed user account. And when I click on sign in with your identity provider, I am redirected to authenticate against my identity provider, in this case, Microsoft Entra ID. And it allows me to log in. Keep in mind, I have already logged in through my Microsoft Entra ID within this browser. So the logging is instant for me. And you can see that it says my username now. But if I now go into my enterprise, because I am an enterprise owner, and I go under identity provider, you'll notice I cannot turn this off. I can, however, edit the SAML configuration by changing the public certificate in case that were to become expired. If I go back, I can also go into people and I can see the users that I have so far. Now, this pretty much concludes how to set up GitHub Enterprise Managed User accounts against Microsoft Entra ID.